afternoon, everybody. Good, good morning to most of the nation. It's only noon on the East Coast. It is 11 o'clock here in the Central Time Zone, and I am Todd Obert, President and CEO of Productive Corporation. Joined alongside me is Pete Greco. He is not fileless, but he will be talking about fileless malware. In fact, he's always looking for places to store his files, as am I, and a lot of options on the network, off the network, on the USB, wherever. So if you have come to our events in the past, I like to say thank you. You know how we roll. We spend less time talking about fluff and more time talking about the subject at hand. So today, like I said, we will be talking about fileless malware, the history, what it kind of looks like, what is the current state, ways that the cyber criminals try to attack and get into the network, as well as ways to remediate. But before that, we will meet Productive in 1 minute or less, and then we will get that microphone and mouse over to Mr. Pete Greco. So buckle up. We know that we have 30 minutes. We know you have 30 minutes. We want to spend it wisely. So let's meet Productive Corporation. Well, who is Productive, you say? Well, I appreciate you asking, because Productive Corporation provides security solutions for mid-sized companies. We have in-house expertise to help with licensing, technical questions, and technology assessment implementation. We also do security assessments, as well as Active Directory services. We can do configuration of your UTM or optimization of your endpoint or encryption or mail service. We also produce tons of third-party content, because that's what our customers have asked us for. We talk about things like this, like fileless malware. All that can be found on productivecorp.com/content, as well as our YouTube channel. The bottom line is we have the resources to help you, whether it's implementation, assessment, licensing, or optimization services. We are here to help. And one of the ways that we do that is by putting on our knowledge series like we are today. As I mentioned at the top of the broadcast, Mr. Pete Greco, our VP of Sales and Technology, is going to talk to you about fileless malware. And Pete has been in this business for a long, long time, almost approaching 20 years. Wow, did I just say that? And has worked with thousands of customers on different security initiatives. He understands the pains you go through on a daily basis, and truly can empathize with what you guys need to do to get your job done. So let's give a warm virtual round of applause for Mr. Pete Greco. Pete?
All right. Thanks so much. Thanks for pointing out my age there, almost, with that 20 years. I like to say more than a couple of years. Is how I throw it out there. But without any...
didn't you start like 10 or 11 years old?
Yes, at a very young age.
You're a prodigy.
I wish that were the case. I wish that were the case. Yeah. All right. Well, let's keep this show rolling. I know everybody is probably eager to get on to lunch and ponder what they're going to do to attack fileless malware. Right. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, as you're already keenly aware. And basically, where fileless malware is successful is it's got nothing for your antivirus or your IPS IDS to scan. This is running in memory. It's leveraging exploits on the machine. It's creating registry entries to help with persistence. But the thing that it's not doing is reading or writing anything to or from disk. And that's where your endpoint security is trying to go to work. So if you're running next-gen AV, it's trying to scan stuff on the disk. If you are running machine learning, which is relatively new, that is trying to scan artifacts as they were read or written from the disk. And so if nothing is happening there, there's nothing for those programs to do. And that doesn't mean that they're not working. This is just a new vector of attack that requires some new thought process on how to defend against it, how to detect it, and how to see what's really going on. So where did we come from? Right? And Todd and I got into this business with Productive Corporation back in 2001. And I remember this as being some of the first stuff that we were seeing back in those days. Now, what I didn't know is that Code Red got its name from the researchers who discovered it were heavily into drinking Code Red Mountain Dew at the time. Fun fact for you. Right? And basically what some of these early things were doing was slowing down machines. They were persistent because they were hard to detect with the protections at that time. They were leveraging known vulnerabilities that were patchable, or where patches had been out for a month or even more. Right? Code Red credited with a few attacks when it was first released in June of 2001. A month later, and when it came out in June, a patch was available to defend against that. When it had its biggest attack vector a month later in July, 400,000 successful server compromises. And where the attack was pretty lame, advanced for the day, but pretty lame compared to today's standards, is it didn't discriminate. It launched on every single machine that it could find, and if the machine didn't have IIS, then there was nothing for it to actually do, right? But it would still be persistent on that machine, and then it would spread from that machine to other machines. But that actually made it a lot more detectable because it was so widespread, right? Whereas today, we're seeing a lot more stealthy attacks where they're first scanning the machine, and if the machine has already been compromised, they don't try and compromise it again. If the machine has the appropriate patches deployed, it doesn't even try and launch an attack. It kills itself instantly. And this helps it propagate without detection, because if it's not actually trying to compromise a machine where it's not going to have success, that's going to be less opportunity for someone to detect it, report it, for the news to spread, for all the AV companies to start creating signatures around it, right? So these were some pretty old-fashioned things. SQL Slammer created so much internet traffic that routers were ground to a halt, but because Slammer itself was so small, it was less than 370 bytes, it could fit into a single packet. A lot of times it could get through, even though the routers were having a hard time passing so much traffic. And crazy thing is, I was getting ready for this. I wanted to get a recollection of what some of these things were doing. SQL Slammer resurges in November and December of last year on old SQL machines, still unpatched. I mean, if we haven't gotten around to applying patches from 2001, we're really in trouble. Also reference Angler. That's an exploit kit. If you want to see some additional information around Angler, we actually did a video last year featuring Locky ransomware, which is getting spread by Nuclear Exploit Kit, among others. And we really do a pretty big discovery of how Nuclear EK works. Angler, very similar. So feel free to check that out on our YouTube channel and see some pretty interesting information. Right? So these threats have continued to evolve and grow. And really the modern thing, like I mentioned earlier, is being able to first figure out, is it going to be successful in running on this machine, killing off if it's not, which allows it to hit a lot more machines and have a lot more success before detection. Right? Now, everybody's starting to talk about next-gen AV and machine learning and this kind of stuff, and this is where Fileless Malware is starting to take hold. And so part of the challenge with it is it can be hard to figure out where it's coming from. Now, a lot of it is originating from phishing and spear phishing attacks, right? And so getting that end user trained appropriately, and it's got to be a little bit more than just telling them to not click on stuff. That's not a realistic piece of advice to give to somebody who receives information all the time that needs to have a PDF downloaded to review. If they're receiving bills from vendors sent electronically, they've got to download and open those to keep the bills getting paid and keep the lights on, right? So we got to make sure that they're understanding, how do I determine a good email from a bad email, and giving them some knowledge to be able to help in that capacity. But when it comes to malvertising and drive-by downloads and some of this stuff, might not even require any end user interaction in order for the threat to come into the environment, right? And sometimes this stuff is happening as part of a chain of events, so that the first couple of things that are happening are a part of a legitimate process, and then the ultimate result is delivering malware. So one of the things that has gotten a lot of publicity, and if you haven't heard about this, a lot of information on JS Palmet, one of the leading fileless malware attacks happening right now. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this. It's pretty crazy, and probably the most disturbing thing is researchers have yet to been able to identify how it gets started. So this begins with an auto start registry entry. Let's see if we can, there we go, with an auto start registry entry that's basically downloading an XML file with malicious script, right? Fun fact, again, don't know how that registry entry is getting started, but that's the initial part of the attack. This allows reg server 32 to fetch a file that is capable of executing a script without saving the XML file. So again, nothing to scan by your AV. And anytime the machine restarts, this is going to get reinitialized. You can kill the attack by cutting the power, but when you start it up, it's going to get redone. The next step is to download a second file that's got a PowerShell script. This connects to a website and downloads a favicon file, right? And once that favicon file gets decrypted, then it starts a lot of methods for attack. And because the processes that it's leveraging are already running, they're getting called, but they've already been scanned when they've launched, so they're not going to get rescanned by your endpoint. And now we can have malicious backdoor droppers happening, file droppers are coming into play, and a whole lot of different exploits are getting leveraged by the attack vector, and none of this stuff is getting scanned or detected by your AV because it's not designed to scan this kind of stuff, right? And this is where they're having a lot of success with these kinds of things. And so some of the ways you can detect some of this stuff, depending on what the threat is potentially in the logs. If privileges are getting escalated, right? That's some of the stuff you can see if you're monitoring for that kind of stuff. One of the concerning things there, though, is when the system account gets compromised and is accessing other stuff. That's very hard to see in the log files, right? So we want to figure out what are some ways we can detect these techniques and prevent these kinds of events. So now this attack is a process. This has not been packaged up. There's no name for what's going on here, but this is a set of techniques that are getting used. And how this starts, right, is SQL injection leveraging exploits against a web server. So if you got web servers out there that are not patched, they're going to be vulnerable to this kind of attack. And what's happening is a web shell is being used to load small scripts using a multitude of languages. So not just getting created in one programming language, but it's happening across a lot of different kinds of languages. So lots of attackers out there with different languages are going to be able to leverage this kind of an attack. It uses a web shell called China Chopper, which runs commands against the server to ultimately gain full access. And once that access is granted, a couple of different things are happening. Credentials, both hashed and non-hashed, are getting downloaded. So credential theft now is giving full access potentially back to that server. And they're doing that through an encoded PowerShell command. So again, nothing to scan there. Those scripts are not scannable, right? And so the next thing that happens then is they're putting the machine, and this is so clever, I can't even believe that somebody could think of this, but they're putting the machine into debug mode, and they're enabling sticky keys, which I'm kind of familiar with that, but I guess I didn't really know what the implications were with sticky keys. But that effectively creates an authorized keystroke logger on the machine, obviously intended for debugging and figuring out why software is not working and this kind of stuff. But now you have an attacker that's got persistent remote access to the machine, and they're able to download the log files, giving them every keystroke that's happened on this machine to further create compromise. And as soon as you start getting this kind of access, the next thing that's going to happen is escalating privileges and getting total control over the web server environment, and potentially ultimately into the main part of the environment. So pretty crazy that guys are thinking of this stuff, but this is where things have escalated from the lone hacker, right, or the hacktivist, trying to get attention, trying to become popular amongst the other tech folks or computer guys or hackers or whatever it is, and this stuff is getting turned into a business. Organizations with lots of capabilities, lots of resources, leveraging things like Amazon in order to test stuff out, launch threats, understand how applications work, so that they can actually test out their attacks before going live with them. So the victims are no longer the beta customer. The victims are now getting a full-on, ready-to-go attack that's going to be successful, right? So once access is achieved here, the kimono is open. All of your data is available to the attacking organization. This paves the way for lots of other attacks to come in and have success. And you can start disabling protections or understanding what the protections are, so that you know what kinds of attacks to launch. So this kind of stuff we have to have access to and have an understanding of very early on in the attack cycle, so that we can prevent the most heinous part at the end of the kill chain from being successful. So how do we prevent this stuff? There's lots of ways, and the key thing that I want to make sure that nobody takes away from this is not an indictment of AV. I'm not saying get rid of AV. Still, as proof of SQL Slammer having a resurgence, endpoint security still extremely important. UTM and next-gen firewall still extremely important. Patching, getting those patches out. The way that most of these exploits are being successful is leveraging a vulnerability in running software, and that can be web servers, it can be in processes that are running, Office tools, Adobe software, right? All of this stuff.
So Pete,
one of the things, yeah.
So when you work in environments, you see why guys aren't patching, right? I mean, I would say almost everybody is aware that you need to be patching. What are some of the ways that guys might not be looking at it correctly when they choose not to patch something?
A lot of times it's simply don't have enough manpower to get started with an automated patch routine. And so there's a lot of great solutions out there, and we can definitely help expose you to some of these where you can get the bulk of your patching fairly automated. You know, on servers, you still got to spend a little bit of time figuring out what's going on. Make sure you've got some test servers that you can deploy patches to help ensure uptime. You want to make sure that you can quickly recover in case there is a bad patch, which we're hearing fewer and fewer stories of where a patch has put a machine into an inoperable state. You know, you'd hear kind of some of that stuff back in the mid 2000s. And I'm not saying that never happens at all, but it's becoming less and less common, right? A lot of research and development is going into those patches because the publishers are getting black eyes from these vulnerabilities. So they've really upped their game in that standpoint, especially Microsoft, who previously was, you know, the #1 exploited program. Adobe has surpassed them. right? And so these guys are trying to up their game. And so I think for a lot of folks, it's actually getting it started. Once they're running, right, and have gotten it figured out, they're feeling pretty good. But doing that initial investigation of trying to figure out what patch solution is right for me, how do I set it up, how do I get all my machines configured, how do I get them into the right groups so that I know where I can really patch quickly and have a good process for doing it. A lot of people get paralyzed with that project, and that's definitely something that we can help you out with, and I'm sure a lot of others. But you got to figure out, how do we make time for it? And if you can kind of start thinking it through, as far as if you're chasing down a lot of threats and a lot of exploits, and that's part of the reason why you're so busy, making those threats null helps get time back into your day. The more time that we're spending putting out fires and chasing stuff down versus figuring out how to proactively avoid that stuff, right? It does give us some time back into the day, but making the leap of the chasm is easier said than done, and we recognize that as well. And that's where we've got a lot of different services to help with that. But really getting started. We also run into a lot of folks where they feel like they can rebuild endpoints pretty quick, so they're not worried about the endpoint. And they spend a lot of time only patching servers, which is great. But every time you're rebuilding an endpoint, a couple things are going on. You're spending the time to do that. So even if you can get it done in, we had one client saying they could rebuild an endpoint or provision an endpoint in under 10 minutes. Well, that's awesome. I mean, that is super quick. But every time you're doing that, you've got an end user not doing anything. They're going to spend time now resetting up their machine the way that they wanted it to be. And potentially you're running the risk of the exploit or the issue that occurred on that endpoint actually failing over or finding those servers, right? And so if you're reimaging an endpoint because it's been crippled with malware, chances are that malware has been trying to spread or potentially has stolen credentials, where now an authorized attack or authorized access to a server can happen, and all the patching in the world didn't help you there because you weren't patching everywhere, right? So a lot of things happening there. Now, a lot of people have been telling me, Todd, getting PowerShell off of those workstations is an easy way to prevent, because a lot of these attacks are leveraging PowerShell and leveraging launching scripts, PowerShell scripts, I mean. And so if you can remove PowerShell from those machines where you don't need it, I've been trying to figure out from some of our clients, how realistic is this for you? It's doable, right? But how realistic is it for you? We don't really ever see any situations in our environment where we need to run PowerShell on a workstation or an employee's machine in order to fix something or figure stuff out. If we did, I'm sure we could easily, re-download it or re-enable it in the program files and be able to do what we need to do, right? And so I'm trying to get some feedback on how realistic it is. But for sure, if you remove the attack vector, then the attack can't work, right? If you say no to the ports, any attacks that come through those ports can't work. If you simply unplug the internet, a lot of drive-by downloads are going to be totally unsuccessful. But that's not necessarily realistic for everybody. So having some ways to monitor privilege, having the least privileged access model in play, which we see a lot of folks where, if you're an admin, you're full-on domain admin, or you're a user, the challenge there is one of those admin accounts gets compromised and somebody's got full access to the system. The other thing that happens is user accounts get compromised. Then they use that account to root around the network and try and figure out how to compromise a more valuable account, or how to get those privileges escalated so that they can become an attacker. Once they gain access to Active Directory, a very common thing is to create a backup account. So you're using a legitimate account to attack, to steal data, to really just have surveillance on the network so that you can figure out what is legitimate operations, so I can commit an attack in a more stealthy fashion, right? But a lot of times what these folks will do is then create a backup account. So if that account gets disabled or they get uncovered, they still have a mechanism for getting in. You don't necessarily want to go straight to your backup account, though, because if you're monitoring for unknown accounts, that might be something that creates an alert. So you want to use a legitimate account as much as you can to perpetrate your attack. One of the ways that you can see that stuff is through network monitoring and SIM. SIM is really huge. We don't see enough folks really even thinking about SIM, though they are spending way too much time combing through logs looking for information. Some of that stuff can be reclaimed with something that digests those logs and points out the stuff that you need to see when you need to see it, not just post remediation, right? And the next thing that we see is a lot of folks have made the investment in a product but haven't made the investment to actually get that product working. And so just buying a SIM, that's the first step, but actually getting it working and leveraging the vendor to help you get that thing really set up and tuned in, that's going to give you the visibility that you need and really save you so much time in the long run. And again, that's one of those situations where I don't have the time to do it. It's hard to cross that chasm, but once you get it done, you actually claim a lot of time back into your day because you're so much more quickly identifying issues. And some of those issues are operational. So it gives you more value beyond security. You're also seeing operational stuff that's happening that gives you good visibility to go and fix problems before they really fester, before you run into like a server down or an application down situation. Continuing to invest in your endpoint. Viruses are not going away, right? Fileless malware is on the rise. Figuring out how to compromise and steal credentials and this kind of stuff, ransomware, all that stuff is on the rise, but still tons and tons and tons of traditional viruses and Trojans and worms floating around, getting reignited from old servers or old images getting loaded and backup files getting redone. Anytime you have something hidden on a backup from a couple years ago, and that company goes into some kind of investigation, maybe they're declaring bankruptcy or there's a lawsuit or whatever, and these images are getting restored from 2 years ago, 5 years ago, that you have the potential for these old threats to resurge, right? So lots of crazy stuff happening there. Application encryption. Not enough folks are talking to us about this. A lot of people are doing full disk encryption. That's becoming fairly commonplace. If a machine gets stolen, right, you want that data to be encoded. But what if somebody's logged onto that machine simultaneous to the hacker who's trying to exfiltrate data? Well, if we're encrypting the application data, so every Word doc as we create it, every Excel file as we create it, that data gets stolen. It's stolen in an encrypted fashion, and it's useless to these folks. And the next thing is, are you moving to the cloud? You got to start thinking about security in the cloud. You can't get fooled that Amazon is protecting you. Now, it's not that they're not doing anything, and it's not that Azure isn't doing anything, but if you put a customer-facing web server in the cloud, you're basically saying, here I am, right? Come in and try and attack me, or what you're really saying is come in and do business with me, but what the hackers are seeing is come in and attack me. And so if you're not looking at products and services in that cloud-authorized security broker space, right, you're going to have a lot of vulnerable machines. They're not doing necessarily a lot more. They might be doing a lot more than what you're doing, right? But we have a lot of clients that are very forward-thinking with their network security, with how they're getting visibility and how they're doing stuff. And the number one thing that they're thinking about is, as I move my servers into Azure or Amazon or at a colo, I am still responsible for protecting those. And what's going to be my next move for keeping that protection? And the other thing that I see with a lot of these forward-thinking folks is really spending that time on configuration and research to be successful there. Go ahead.
Hey, Pete. Yeah. So back your previous point on application encryption. I know in the past a lot of encryption solutions, at least to me, seemed kind of clunky or difficult to deploy. Is that changing? Is that getting easier to deploy encryption?
Yes. So two answers to that, Todd. I would say deployment, for sure, you want to leverage pro services. It's going to take a lot less time to let us or let the vendor help you get that rolling. Management has gotten a lot easier. So previously, I think it was hard to deploy and hard to manage. I think the deployment has eased up, but still a more complicated thing than endpoints, can be more complicated than configuring firewalls, especially if you don't have a lot of experience with it, right? So getting help, getting it set up, I think is key and crucial, but the ongoing management has really gotten a lot easier. And it's gotten a lot more into the capability to kind of have a set it and forget it. I think the big thing that folks are nervous about when we talk about encryption is what happens if I basically ransomware myself here and get a machine encrypted and I can't get it decrypted, right? And those kinds of issues are really few and far between. I mean, I don't think we see those anymore. As long as you got that thing set up, managing those keys has gotten a lot easier, and even having the capability for the end user to do some self-service or password reset a lot easier, especially for full disk, but even the application encryption, once you've got it set up, relatively easy to manage and control.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much, Pete, and thanks everybody for taking the time to come see the presentation. Your account exec's going to be following up with you if you want a recording or a link to that recording. Let them know. Also, this will get posted out at on the YouTube channel, Productive Content, where this and many other knowledge series and educational content are posted. So for now, I'm Todd Obert along with Pete Greco, wishing you a fantastic balance of your day and week, and hopefully we'll talk soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.